Welcome back. In the last video, we implemented turning with a rate using the keyboard or using the console right thumbstick. In this video, we're going to add the capability to turn with the mouse. Let's get started. First, we're going to go to our project settings and click on Input, and we're going to add a couple new axis mappings. I'm going to go ahead and close the drop downs for the 4 that we already have, and let's add 2 more. The first one I'm going to call Turn. Now this one will be mapped to the mouse x-axis, mouse x. And the second one I'm going to call Look Up. And this one will be mapped to the mouse y. Now, depending on the functionality you'll want, we may or may not scale this by -1. Some people like the camera to look up when you move the mouse down, and others like the camera to look down when you move the mouse down. So we'll see how it feels and adjust this as needed. Now we gave these axis mappings the names turn and look up as opposed to turn rate and look up rate. These are moving at a certain rate, which we created those floats, base lookup rate and base turn rate for. But for turn and look up, we're simply going to get the mouse input value and change the controller based on that. Here in Setup Player Input Component, we're going to copy a couple of these lines here. And for the axis names, we're going to just use turn and look up. Now for the functions, instead of making our own functions, we're just going to call functions directly that we've inherited from the pawn class. We're going to call a pawn add controller yaw input. So since we're not scaling the input value by anything, and we're just going to pass it straight into add controller yaw input, we can call that function directly instead of making our own. For the lookup axis mapping, we're going to use a pawn add controller pitch input. And this is all we need to do. Now back in the editor, if we press play and click in the viewport, you'll see that every frame, our mouse X and Y axes are passing in data. And each frame, depending on how quickly we're moving the mouse, that value will change. Now, if I move the mouse up, then I look down. Now, if you don't like that, if you want to look up when you move the mouse up, then we can simply go back into project settings and look at our lookup axis mapping, and for mouse Y, we can scale this by -1. Now when we go back and press play, when I move the mouse down, I look down. When I move it up, I look up. So if that's what you prefer, then you'll want that scaled by -1. Okay, so that takes care of mouse rotation. We're simply rotating the controller based on input from the mouse. And because we've set our camera boom to follow the controller, it's moving along with the controller, and our camera is attached to the camera boom. Now finally, we're going to add some jump functionality. So in project settings, this time instead of an axis mapping, we're going to use an action mapping, because a jump only requires a single function call as soon as a key is pressed. We don't need something to happen every frame as long as a key is held down, which is what axis mappings are for. So let's add an action mapping. We're going to call this jump. And I'm going to use the space bar for the keyboard. So click this icon and hit the space bar. And I'm going to add another one for our console controller. I want this to be gamepad face button bottom. Now on an Xbox controller, that's the bottom button on the right side of the controller, which is the A button. And on a PlayStation controller, that's going to be the X button. Okay, so we have an action mapping for the spacebar and the gamepad face button bottom. Let's go back into Visual Studio and bind this action mapping. So we're going to say player input component, and instead of bind axis, we're going to call bind action. It's going to take the name of the action mapping. We called it jump. And it's also going to take an enum constant for whether or not the key is pressed or released. If we look at the second overload, we'll see that it's an e input event enum constant. And the constant for pressed is IE underscore pressed. For the user class, it's going to be this. And for the function, we're going to simply call the jump function we've inherited from the character class. So use the address of operator, and we're going to call a character jump. Now we're also going to bind another function to the same action, only instead of IE pressed, we're going to use IE released. And that's because a character has another function called stop jumping. So that'll be called when we release the key. So action mappings are very efficient. They result in only a single function call when the key is pressed and a single function call when the key is released, if you've bound functions to pressed and released. So let's go ahead and compile this. I'm going to close project settings and click play, click in the viewport and hit the space key, and you'll see that I'm jumping. Now it's a little hard to see our capsule because we haven't added a mesh. Don't worry, we'll do that in the next video. But we have jumping functionality. I'm going to grab my console controller and hit the gamepad face button bottom, and we'll see that we get jumping as well from the console controller. So all is looking great. So now that we have basic movement functionality scripted out, we're going to add a mesh to our character so that we don't have to just stare at this capsule component. We want to stare at an actual shooter character. So we'll do that in the next video.